My in-laws demanded I quit my job to raise their grandkids. I had other plans. My name is Emily. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought my marriage was built on mutual respect. I had a career I genuinely loved. I wasn't some billionaire CEO or famous entrepreneur, but I had worked for nearly a decade to earn my position as a senior project manager at a tech company. The job paid well, challenged me every day, and gave me a sense of independence that meant everything to me. My husband, Ryan, always claimed he admired that about me. Or at least, that's what I believed. Everything changed the day my sister-in-law announced she was expecting twins. The family gathered for dinner to celebrate, and everyone was excited. My mother-in-law couldn't stop talking about how wonderful it would be to have more grandchildren around. Then she looked directly at me. Finally have someone to take care of during the weekdays. I laughed because I assumed it was a joke. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she calmly explained that since I worked from home 3 days a week, I could quit my job entirely and become the primary caregiver for not only our future children, but also my sister-in-law's Bobbies whenever she needed help. I stared at her. I'm sorry, what? My father-in-law nodded like the plan had already been approved. Family should sacrifice for family. Ryan didn't defend me. He simply reached for another bread roll and quietly said, Mom has a point. That single sentence hit harder than I expected. I thought maybe they were brainstorming unrealistic ideas after too much wine, but over the next few weeks, the comments became constant. When are you planning to resign? You don't need that stressful career. Mother's place is with children. The family has enough income if Ryan keeps working. The most unbelievable part, nobody had asked what I wanted. They acted as though my career belonged to them to redistribute. At first, I brushed it off politely. Then the pressure escalated. One Saturday, my mother-in-law invited me over to discuss the future. When I arrived, she had printed spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets. She had estimated the daycare costs everyone would save if I stayed home. She highlighted numbers in yellow and proudly announced that I could save the extended family tens of thousands of dollars over the next few years. She called it an investment. I called it volunteering me for unpaid labor. Ryan looked over the papers and said, It does make financial sense. I looked at him in disbelief. For everyone except me. He shrugged. We're married. What's mine is yours. I couldn't help replying, funny. Apparently what's mine is everyone's. That earned me a long lecture about selfishness. According to my in-laws, I was putting ambition ahead of family values. They reminded me that Ryan's mother had left her own job decades earlier and expected me to follow the same path. What they conveniently ignored was that she had chosen to do that. Choice makes all the difference. Still, I tried to keep the peace. I changed the subject whenever it came up. I smiled through awkward dinners. I politely declined every helpful suggestion. But then the surprise attack arrived. Ryan came home one evening looking unusually cheerful. Got great news. I asked what happened. He told me he'd spoken with our financial advisor and started working on a household budget based on my expected resignation. Expected, not discussed, expected. I honestly thought he was kidding. Then he slid a printed budget across the kitchen counter. My salary was gone, completely erased. In its place was a line labeled childcare contribution. I felt my stomach drop. You already planned my unemployment, he answered with complete sincerity. We all agreed this was best. We, my parents, my sister, and me. I looked around the empty kitchen and wondered when exactly I had stopped being part of the conversation about my own life. That night I barely slept. Instead, I replayed every moment from the past year, every dismissive comment, every time Ryan called my work just a job. Every family dinner where his parents treated my career like a temporary hobby. And slowly, something clicked. They weren't asking me to make a sacrifice. They had already decided my future for me. The next morning, my mother-in-law texted asking whether I'd drafted my resignation letter. I replied with 3 words. Working on it. She responded with heart emojis and congratulations. What none of them realized was that I really was making plans, just not the plans they expected. For the next 2 weeks, I played along. Whenever Ryan asked if I had made progress on my resignation letter, I'd smile and tell him I was handling it. When my mother-in-law called to ask when she could start telling relatives that I was becoming a full-time caregiver, I'd say, soon enough. They thought they had won. Meanwhile, I was doing something entirely different. I met with my company's leadership team and shared that another business had reached out to recruit me. I hadn't planned on leaving, But after everything happening at home, I wanted to understand my options. To my surprise, my manager didn't want to lose me. Instead of accepting another offer, I was presented with a promotion, a larger salary, and the opportunity to lead a new division that would require occasional travel and even more responsibility. It was the exact opposite of quitting. I accepted without hesitation. I signed the paperwork that afternoon and walked out of the office with a grin I hadn't worn in weeks. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my future belonged to me again. I kept the promotion private, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to see how far my in-laws would take their assumptions. As it turned out, very far. One Sunday, Ryan announced that his parents wanted everyone over for a family planning dinner. Phrase alone made me suspicious. The moment we arrived, I noticed a whiteboard set up in the dining room. A whiteboard. My father-in-law had drawn a weekly schedule with colored markers, Monday through Friday, drop-offs, pickups, feeding times, nap schedules, doctor appointments. There was even a section labeled Emily's responsibilities. My name appeared in almost every box. I scanned the chart in disbelief. According to this masterpiece, I would be watching children from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, preparing meals, handling laundry, running errands, and somehow managing grocery shopping for everyone. There wasn't a single line asking whether I agreed. Ryan smiled proudly. Dad spent hours making this. His mother added, "We knew you'd appreciate how organized everything is." Almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity had become impossible to ignore. Then my sister-in-law chimed in. "Finally be able to rest after the Bobbies arrive. It'll be nice knowing you're covering weekdays." Covering weekdays? She hadn't even asked. The entire family had built a future that depended on me giving up mine. I quietly asked, "What if I don't resign?" The room went silent. My mother-in-law answered first. "You will." My father-in-law nodded. "It's the only sensible choice." Ryan reached over and squeezed my hand. "We've all made sacrifices before." I gently pulled my hand away. "I haven't agreed to any of this." Atmosphere changed instantly. Smiles disappeared. His mother frowned. Being difficult. His father muttered something about modern women forgetting their priorities. Ryan sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Emily, don't embarrass us." Embarrass us? I looked around the table and realized that I wasn't the one making unreasonable demands. Still, I stayed calm. I simply stood up, thanked them for dinner, and left the room before saying something I'd regret. On the drive home, Ryan barely spoke. When we reached the house, he finally broke the silence. "If you loved this family, you'd do this." I answered just as quietly. "If you loved me, you wouldn't ask." He slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, I woke up to discover that my mother-in-law had already told extended relatives that I was retiring from my career to dedicate myself to childcare. People I'd barely met were sending congratulatory messages. One cousin wrote, "It's wonderful you're embracing your true calling." Another relative said she admired my selflessness. Stared at my phone in complete disbelief. My decision had become public before I had even made one, so I decided it was time for everyone to hear the truth. The annual family barbecue was only a few days away, and nearly every relative would be there. Ryan assumed we'd use the gathering to announce my resignation. His parents were already planning a celebratory toast. I let them believe it. After all, I really did have an announcement prepared. It just wasn't the one anyone expected. The day of the barbecue arrived, and the atmosphere was almost festive. My mother-in-law had decorated the backyard with balloons and flowers. There was a long buffet table loaded with food, kids running around the lawn, and relatives I hadn't seen in years greeting each other like it was a reunion. The second Ryan and I walked through the gate, his aunt rushed over and hugged me. "So proud of you," she whispered. "Giving up your career for family is such a beautiful thing." I forced a smile. "Thanks." I didn't have the heart to explain that I'd never agreed to any of it. As more guests arrived, I realized the story had spread even further than I imagined. Cousins congratulated me. Family friends told me I'd never regret my decision. One elderly relative even joked that I could finally stop playing businesswoman. Each comment made it clearer that someone had been speaking on my behalf. I knew exactly who. An hour later, my father-in-law tapped his glass with a spoon. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" Conversations faded. He stood in the center of the yard with a huge smile on his face. "We're gathered today not only to enjoy good food, but also to celebrate Emily's wonderful decision to dedicate herself to raising the next generation of our family." People clapped. Ryan clapped too. Then my mother-in-law gestured for me to come stand beside them. I walked forward, feeling dozens of eyes on me. She handed me a glass of lemonade and said, "Go ahead, dear. Tell everyone the good news." I looked around the yard. Every face was waiting. Some looked excited, some looked emotional. A few already had their phones out to record. I cleared my throat. "Actually," I began, "I do have an announcement." Ryan smiled confidently. His parents looked delighted. "I'm not resigning." The applause stopped instantly. You could have heard a fork hit the patio. "Staying in my career," I continued, "and I recently accepted a promotion that comes with more responsibility, more travel, and a significant pay increase." A stunned silence settled over the crowd. Then came the whispers. "What promotion?" I thought she was quitting. "Didn't they already decide?" My mother-in-law's smile vanished. "That isn't funny," she said. "I'm not joking." Ryan leaned closer and lowered his voice. "You're embarrassing my parents." I answered just loud enough for the people nearest us to hear. "What's embarrassing is announcing someone else's life choices without asking them." His father stepped forward. "Who's supposed to watch the children now?" I blinked. "Their parents." A few people actually chuckled. My sister-in-law folded her arms. "We were counting on you." "I know," I replied. That was the problem. For several uncomfortable seconds, nobody said anything. Then Ryan's cousin broke the silence. "Wait, nobody ever asked Emily if she wanted this." Heads slowly turned toward my in-laws. My mother-in-law tried to recover. "We assumed she understood her responsibilities." I shook my head. "Responsibility is to make decisions about my own life. I'm happy to help family when I choose to, but I'm not giving up a career I've worked years to build because someone else volunteered me." Mood shifted almost immediately. Several relatives who had been congratulating me minutes earlier now looked uneasy. One aunt admitted she'd believed I had chosen to leave work. An uncle quietly muttered, "That changes things." Ryan looked frustrated. "You could have told everyone privately." "I tried," I replied. "For months." I reminded him about the conversations at dinner, the spreadsheets, the childcare schedules, the budget that erased my salary, and the countless times I'd said I wasn't comfortable with the plan. Every example chipped away at the version of events his parents had been presenting. Finally, his grandmother, who had been silent the entire afternoon, spoke up. She looked directly at my mother-in-law and said, "When I stayed home with my children, it was because I wanted to. Nobody chose for me." Yard fell quiet again. Even my father-in-law seemed unsure what to say. Ryan looked from his parents to me, realizing that for the first time, the rest of the family was hearing the full story instead of the carefully edited version. And that's when his mother made one last attempt to regain control. She pointed at me and declared, "If Emily won't put family first, then perhaps she shouldn't expect to be treated like family." I set my glass down on the nearest table, met her gaze, and replied calmly, "Respect isn't earned by surrendering your future. And being part of a family should never require giving up your voice." The barbecue ended not with cheers or celebration, but with awkward goodbyes, whispered conversations, and more than a few relatives quietly rethinking everything they'd been told. The barbecue ended, but the fallout was only beginning. By the time Ryan and I got home, both of our phones were buzzing nonstop. Some relatives sent supportive messages. Others wanted to know if the argument had really happened the way they'd heard. And then there were the texts from my mother-in-law. One after another. "You humiliated this family. You made us look foolish. I hope you're proud of yourself." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to explain. Ryan, however, was furious. The moment we stepped inside, he tossed his car keys onto the counter and turned to me. "You blindsided everyone." I folded my arms. "I corrected a false announcement. You should have handled it differently." "I tried. For months." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked upstairs and shut himself in the bedroom. For the next few days, the house felt strangely quiet. We spoke only when absolutely necessary, and every conversation ended the same way, with him insisting that I had overreacted and me pointing out that no one had ever respected my answer in the first place. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan's grandmother called me. She invited me over for tea. When I arrived, she greeted me warmly and motioned for me to sit. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said. "And I owe you an apology." I looked surprised. "You didn't do anything." "I stayed silent while everyone else assumed they could decide your future," she replied. "Silence can sometimes look like agreement." She reached into a small wooden cabinet and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures from decades ago. One photo showed her standing in front of a tiny storefront with a handwritten sign. "That was my sewing business," she said with a smile. I opened it after your father-in-law was born. I didn't know that. Most people don't. The family pressured me to close it because they thought mothers shouldn't work. What did you do? She laughed softly. I ignored them. Spent hours talking about independence, compromise, and how easily expectations become obligations when no one challenges them. Before I left, she squeezed my hand. Never let someone else write your story. Those words stayed with me. Back at home, things only became stranger. Packages began arriving almost every day. A high chair, a stroller, boxes of baby toys, a portable crib. At first, I assumed they'd been delivered to the wrong address. Then I noticed the shipping labels. Every single one had my name on it. I called my sister-in-law. Did you accidentally send your baby supplies here? She sounded confused. Mom said you'd be setting up a nursery since you'll have the kids during the week. I nearly dropped the phone. She told you that. She said everything was already arranged. Hanging up, I stared at the growing pile of unopened boxes in the living room. Someone had spent money furnishing a childcare space I had never agreed to create. That evening, when Ryan got home, I pointed to the mountain of deliveries. What is all this? He hesitated. I may have given them our address. You what? They found some sales online. Whose house? Ours. As a nursery. He looked away. It seemed practical. That word again. Everything was practical as long as someone else paid the price. I grabbed a marker, wrote "Return to Sender" across the shipping labels, and scheduled every package to be picked up the following morning. When my mother-in-law learned what I'd done, she called in disbelief. Why would you send them back? Because they don't belong here. But where will the Bobbies sleep? In their own home, I answered calmly. She accused me of being cold. I told her that planning my life without my permission didn't magically become reasonable just because she called it family. For the first time since this all started, she had no comeback. Then came the biggest surprise of all. The following Friday, Ryan asked if we could have dinner without distractions. No phones, no television, just the two of us. Halfway through the meal, he admitted something I never expected to hear. Parents have been pushing this idea for over a year, he said quietly. Long before they ever mentioned it to you. I stared at him. You knew, he nodded. They kept saying you were too focused on work, and that once enough people encouraged you, you'd eventually give in. Instead of shutting it down. I hoped they were right. The room fell silent. In that moment, I realized the real issue had never been babysitting or careers. It was trust. Because once someone starts making life-changing decisions on your behalf and expects you to smile and accept them, it becomes impossible to ignore just how little your choices have been respected all along. And I knew the next conversation would determine whether our marriage could recover, or whether this was the beginning of an entirely different future. Ryan's confession stayed with me for days. It wasn't just that he had known about his parents' plans. It was that he had quietly waited for enough pressure to make me surrender. Every conversation we'd had over the past year suddenly looked different. Every suggestion from his family, every awkward dinner, every comment about me working too much, they weren't random observations. They were part of a coordinated effort, and somehow I was the last person to realize it. The following Monday, I left for my first leadership meeting in my new role. The promotion meant presenting to executives from different offices, and I spent weeks preparing. The presentation went better than I could have imagined. When it was over, my boss pulled me aside. You handled that brilliantly. We'd like you to mentor the next group of project leads. I thanked him, but my mind wandered. At work, people trusted me with million-dollar decisions. At home, some people didn't trust me to make decisions about my own life. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. That evening, I returned home to find Ryan sitting at the kitchen table. There was an envelope in front of him. I've been thinking, he said. Have I? He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to his parents. He had drafted an apology not to me, but to them. He wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding at the barbecue and reassure them that, with enough discussion, I would eventually reconsider. I looked up slowly. You still think this is negotiable? He hesitated. I think everyone just needs more time. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it toward him. They need boundaries. For the first time since we'd married, I spent the night at a hotel. Not because I wanted drama, but because I needed silence. The next morning, I ordered breakfast, opened my laptop, and wrote down every major decision I wanted for my own future. Continue growing my career, travel, finish my professional certification, start a scholarship fund one day for girls interested in technology, maybe become a parent someday, but only if and when I chose to. Not one item on that list involved becoming unpaid childcare for the entire extended family. Seeing it written down gave me clarity. I wasn't running away from family. I was running toward the life I had spent years building. When I returned home that weekend, Ryan told me his parents wanted another meeting. I declined. He insisted it would help. I declined again, so naturally they showed up at our front door unannounced. My father-in-law carried a folder. My mother-in-law carried cookies. Apparently one brought paperwork while the other brought baked goods, as if that combination could solve everything. They settled onto the couch before I even offered them seats. Then the folder came out. Inside was a typed agreement, an actual agreement. It outlined expectations for weekly childcare, holidays, emergency coverage, overnight stays, and even proposed vacation schedules. At the bottom was a blank line labeled Emily's signature. I blinked twice just to make sure I was reading it correctly. "You want me to sign this?" My mother-in-law smiled. "It just keeps everyone accountable." I looked at Ryan. "You knew about this." He rubbed the back of his neck but didn't answer. That silence told me enough. I carefully closed the folder, stood up, walked to the front door, opened it, and handed the papers back. "I won't be signing anything." Father-in-law frowned. "You haven't even negotiated." "There's nothing to negotiate." His expression hardened. "That's your final answer?" "Yes." He gathered the folder and stood. Before leaving, he turned around and said, "One day you'll regret choosing work over family." I met his gaze without raising my voice. "No, I'd regret letting other people choose my life for me." Door closed behind them. The house was quiet again. Ryan remained standing in the hallway, staring at the floor. After several minutes, he finally whispered, "I never thought it would get this far." I answered honestly. It got this far the moment everyone decided my answer didn't matter. Over the next few weeks, something interesting happened. Without me stepping in, everyone else had to solve their own problems. My sister-in-law and her husband interviewed babysitters. They rearranged work schedules. The grandparents volunteered some of their own time. Neighbors pitched in occasionally. In other words, the impossible situation they insisted only I could fix turned out to have plenty of solutions. The only solution they truly wanted was the one that cost them the least, and that realization made every previous demand impossible to ignore. Then, one quiet Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Ryan's grandmother. It was only a single sentence. "You stayed true to yourself. I'm proud of you." I smiled for the first time in weeks, because despite all the arguments, the rumors, the pressure, and the expectations, I hadn't lost the one thing that mattered most: my ability to decide my own future.